Metal Gear Solid 3 is heralded as generally being the best of the entirety of the Metal Gear saga, and so going into it, I had relatively high expectations. The only minor problem going into this game was the fact that because of my background knowledge of Metal Gear, I pretty much already knew the entirety of the story ahead of time. So a lot of the story beats that would normally hit a lot harder for a first-time player just weren't there for me. And because of that, the emphasis laid heavily on gameplay this time around rather than story. And I'm fully aware that a lot of that is my fault and makes the review in essence already flawed from the very beginning. But the reason that I'm giving you all of this background knowledge is because unfortunately I think that this has the very large potential to be one of my most controversial review videos that I've ever done. And that's simply because I don't see what everyone else sees in this game. And that's not to say that it's a bad game. Far from that. This is an incredible video game. It's a technical achievement for its time, and it holds up today. It's still fun to play. That being said, I just can't on any planet see how anybody could look at this game and think that it's anywhere close to something like Metal Gear Solid 5. Regardless, I am going to try my best to put aside the comparisons to MGS5 for most of the game, although I think it'll be brought up once again when we start talking about gameplay. Regardless, let's get the review properly started. So I'm going to be using the same format that I used for my MGS2 review because that only seems to make sense. And because of that, we're going to be talking about the tutorial and the controls. When it comes to tutorializing the way that you play, I think just like MGS2, this is pretty lacking. It doesn't seem like they made too many improvements from last time. Once again, if you want to figure out how to control your character, you can call around on the codec, but a lot of features that you're going to need to know how to do may not necessarily be covered in those codec calls, and so once again, we're bringing up the manual. As with MGS2, I'm not going to be so hard on the game because technically the manual would have been provided with the game, and as such, that's context for what your different actions are bound to. As a minor note, just like with MGS2, I once again am playing this on PC, and once again am playing it on a mouse and keyboard. I know this wasn't necessarily the intended input device, but I think it works out here, and I don't think that I lost or gained anything because I played on mouse and keyboard. On the topic of how controlling your character felt, I think that this was a major improvement from Metal Gear Solid 2, although the game also plays very, very differently from Metal Gear Solid 2. The most important difference between MGS2 and 3 is that platforming sections have been all but removed from the game, and it is 100% for the better. As I mentioned in my MGS2 review, the vast majority of my deaths stemmed from very wonky and jank parkour controls, and with the introduction of MGS3, well, we don't have that problem anymore, and the game is just better for it. Overall, the game, all these years later, definitely continues to feel good to play, and if you have reservations on picking this up because it's an old game and you assume that it's going to control bad, while the controls are definitely different, it's nothing that you can't get used to and finish the game no problem. So gameplay is where the game has taken probably 3 steps forward and 1 step back from Metal Gear Solid 2. Of course, naturally, the first thing that I absolutely have to mention, and the hands down biggest difference between these two entries, is the fact that in Metal Gear Solid 3, you actually play a video game. I know, crazy. While the game is still absolutely heavily narratively focused, which I don't have any problems with, this time around, the mandatory codec calls are cut down significantly. I think I can remember like 2 or 3 off the top of my head. And comparing that to the previous game, where it felt like every 7 steps there was a codec call or a cutscene, God, it feels so much better. In fact, playing the game, honestly, it was almost jarring just how little the codec played into the game at all. And let me make that clear, I think that that's a good thing. It was just weird coming off the heels of MGS2. Now, I think the real difference maker here is, of course, the swap from the top-down camera angle of Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2 to the now third-person camera of Metal Gear Solid 3. And yes, I'm fully aware that the original Metal Gear Solid 3 launched with a janky, terrible camera, and that the Subsistence version updated it to be third-person, which is what the current remake on PC is. And the end-all be-all is I'm judging the game based off of what I played, not what it was in the past. And I can say that the introduction of the third-person camera angle definitely switches up gameplay a fair bit. Now granted, I don't really think that either camera angle is better or worse necessarily. And the reason that I say that is because I think one of the big reasons that MGS 1 and 2 can still hold up today is because of their camera angles. Those games are sort of products of their time, but because of that, they play so radically different from something like MGS 3 or MGS 5 that it gives you a reason to go back and play those games because they're just so different. And that's where we sort of start with some of the issues when it comes to this game having the third-person perspective and a lot of gameplay similarities to today's Metal Gear. Mostly stemming from the fact that I think a lot of the mechanics after playing 5 just feel like a worse version of that. And that's really what it comes down to. While I could sit down here and give you a ton of specifics on what is done better in MGS 5 versus MGS 3, playing 3, it just feels like you're playing a worse, less refined version of 5. And that makes sense given the times, but I'm playing the game today based on my standards today. That's just how I review games. Now, aside from the camera angles and the way the game actually plays itself, I think the biggest innovation coming from MGS 2 to 3 is, of course, the CQC system. You're heavily encouraged right from the beginning of the game to remember the basics of CQC, and if you do, well, it honestly causes some more problems. Now let me make this clear. I love the CQC system, and I think it works fantastically. But I also think that the CQC system probably could have used a bit of balancing tweaks. The reason I say that is because when it comes to stealth, CQC is fantastic. The fact that you can grab enemies from an actually decent distance now is so much better than in MGS 1 and 2, where if you wanted to grab enemies, you basically had to be on top of them. Here, as long as you're close enough, Snake will do a little animation and then grab the enemy. Not only that, but just like in MGS 2, if you manage to grab somebody quick enough, they won't be able to call out for their friends in order to get help, and if they don't have a radio, they're not going to be able to radio for backup. All of these things are just quality of life things that over the lifetime of Metal Gear have slowly improved the stealth little by little. Now that being said, what I'm going to say might be controversial, but I feel like this game is just too easy. Now, I already see the comments. Eclipse, you probably played on a really low difficulty, and admittedly, I did play on normal mode. Although, granted, the difficulties were very easy, normal, and hard, so technically I played on the second hardest original difficulty. I know there's extreme and Euro extreme, but when you're starting the game, I figured normal was a pretty decent pick, especially since I picked normal for MGS 2 and it was a fair challenge. But in MGS 3, normal mode feels like it might as well have been easy mode, and that stems mostly, I think, from the cure system in the game, as well as the CQC system. Because when you combine these two together, it trivializes a lot of the encounters. I haven't talked about the cure system, so let's cover that first before we get onto the whole difficulty thing. The cure system is absolutely pointless, and I have no clue how this ever got into the game. It's tedious, there's nothing fun about it, and I have no idea why Metal Gear fans ever liked this. It's horrible. It's probably the only just direct negative that I have when it comes to this game. There's just no redeeming factors here. Basically, when you take damage, there's two types of damage you can take. Normal damage, which takes away a very small amount of your health bar, and serious injuries, which take away a fair amount of your health bar, as well as give this little red indicator. If you take a serious injury, you need to pause the game, go to your cure menu, and then pick out all the different specific medical items that you need to use in order to fix up whatever injury you have. Now, the game teaches you how to use the cure menu very early on, thankfully, and it's really not hard whatsoever to figure out what you need to use to fix different wounds. The problem with the system is that, number one, it means that while you're playing the game, if you take damage and then you take a serious injury, while you're in the middle of a battle, you just pause the game and start digging around in your inventory trying to get all of the items you need in order to heal. it is a total pace breaker. Not only that, but it just feels kind of stupid. It's one of those suspension of disbelief things where I just can't suspend my disbelief. When you're playing Zelda and you're getting attacked and you pause the game to go eat a meal, that's something I can suspend my disbelief because Zelda's a really outlandish story. And don't get me wrong, Metal Gear has a ridiculous amount of absolutely bonkers, insane stuff in it, but it's still somewhat grounded in reality. What isn't grounded in reality is pausing the game and then seeing an animation of Snake pulling a bullet out of his arm. Okay, well, if we're going off of that, now all I can see in my head is Snake saying, yo, stop, don't shoot. I have to heal myself. And it just feels dumb. I'm sure there are going to be some people that say that eating rations isn't realistic, and that's not the point. It doesn't matter if it's realistic or not. It's just so far past the suspension of disbelief that I just don't buy it. Regardless, the other issue with this whole system is the fact that in order to facilitate the fact that you can't heal yourself with rations anymore, and the fact that your health slowly regenerates over time, they had to make it so that way if you got caught, you didn't take massive amounts of damage anymore. In previous games, if you started getting shot, your health bar would chunk away very quickly. But in here, you can get riddled with bullets and see your health bar only decrease very minutely. And so this is where those two systems come into play to just make encounters, well, kind of pointless, and make me wonder if I had just ran through the entire game, if I would have been able to win the whole thing, and that does not inspire confidence. Basically, I learned very, very early on that if I got caught, trying to run away, hide, and then wait out all of the timers was a complete waste of effort, because what you can actually do is just beeline it straight towards the nearest enemy, CQC to instantly knock them out, beeline it to the next enemy, CQC, beeline, CQC, and you can do that over and over and over again until the entire area is clear of enemies, and then that's a wrap. Now, this whole thing is kind of funny because it's honestly a perfect showcasing of the reason that Metal Gear Solid 2 had its sort of endless respawning enemies problem. In that game, I found it sort of frustrating that you could just kill enemies forever and they would endlessly send reinforcements. And thankfully, in Metal Gear Solid 3, that doesn't happen. If you clear out an area in its entirety, even if the area is on alert, they won't send an unlimited supply of guys. And I think that this would have worked just fine if it wasn't so unbelievably easy to clear out all of the guys. At the end of the day, I'm pretty sure I finished my playthrough with 2 or 3 game overs total, as opposed to my probably 20 or 30 pretty much entirely from insta-kills in MGS2, and I can say that every single one of those game overs was another instant fail state just like in MGS2. One other gameplay system that I've neglected to mention up until this point that I think is actually really good, and one of the complaints that I didn't quite understand about this game despite hearing it a lot before playing it, was the camouflage system. I know, some of you who played this game are probably going to be like, what the hell, Eclipse? What is wrong with you? But no, seriously, I never had a problem with this. So basically, while playing through MGS3, you have the opportunity to go into your menu and switch out to different camouflages. And depending on which camouflage you have equipped, it'll increase or decrease your camo index in the top of the screen, and depending on how high the percentage is, depends on how easy or hard it is to detect you. It does lead to some kind of funny moments where you have very good camo, but you're not actually concealed at all and an enemy is standing right there and can't see Snake 3 feet in front of them. But overall, I think the camouflage system works really well. And the reason that I think it works really well is that, generally speaking, every time I got to a new area, I would check my surroundings and then go into my menu to switch out my camo to whatever I thought would fit. And the thing that I don't understand about the complaints about this system is that people were making it seem like you had to swap out your camos every 7 steps. And that was never the case. Literally never. When I got to an area, opened up my camo index, and figured out whatever I thought was the best option, it was basically always the best option for the entire time I was in that area. Maybe I just wasn't paying enough attention and I wasn't min-maxing as much as everyone else, but I think I went into my camo index maybe 20 times throughout the entirety of the game and always had around 80% camo when it came to going prone and crawling around, so I'm not sure. Maybe I just did something different than everyone else, but I really enjoyed the system and I thought it was good. Now granted, it would have been better if it was easier to swap camos, something that I know the remake is improving on, but even so, this was one of the largest complaints I always heard about MGS3, and well, I just can't reciprocate. I thought it was alright. On the final note, when it comes to gameplay, I do want to talk about the boss fights. Now, I'm re-editing this section of the video because initially I went through and covered every single boss fight and how I felt about all of them, but I just don't think that's necessary. Overall, I think the boss fights in the game are simultaneously some of the most interesting parts of the game, but also some of the strangest and hardest for me to understand. Mostly because I almost feel like the sort of throwing your head against the wall to just sort of brute force the boss worked for most of the bosses in the game, and not only did it work, but it was just flat out effective, and so I never felt that I needed to engage with the boss's mechanics, and for those that I did need to engage with the mechanics for, I didn't quite get the mechanics. So to give you examples, the Ocelot fight is definitely the fight that came the closest to killing me, and I just didn't get it. I'm not sure what I was missing, and I probably should have used the codec once I started getting a little bit frustrated, but the end-all be-all is, you're fighting against Ocelot in a canyon. He's on one side of the canyon, you're on the other. There are rocks that give the both of you cover, but the problem is that Ocelot can arc his shots in order to bounce off of things and hit you while you're in cover. So basically what this led to is if I'm out in the open, I get shot, and if I go behind cover, I get shot. So it just sort of led to me and him standing out in the open, shooting each other back and forth, and whoever runs out of health first wins. He ended up running out of health first, so I win. There were points where I tried to throw concussion grenades and such, but nothing seemed to be that effective, so I ended up just shooting the guy. And that persisted into most of the boss fights in the game. The fear, shoot him till he's dead. The pain, shoot him till he's dead, but use a shotgun. The fury, shoot him till he's dead. Like, I don't know what I'm missing here. Now granted, there were some really good boss fights in the game. Personally, I think that the end was fantastic. For those who may not know, the end is a sniper. And the fight against him is effectively a sniper battle, as it very quickly gives you a sniper rifle when you enter his area. Now, the arena that you fight the end in is actually 4 or 5 separate arenas. When the end shoots at you, or you shoot at the end, he'll get up and move to a completely different section of the map, and then you need to track him down. It was super interesting and fun to track the end down to the different maps that he goes to, and not only that, it was always stressful going from one map to another because I knew that there was just as equally a chance that the end would be waiting for me as him going to a completely different area. And that led to some moments where I would crawl through a whole area paranoid of getting shot and then never take any damage. This might initially sound kind of bad, but in my opinion, the fact that the threat was ever present even when he wasn't in the area was fantastic. My only real kind of critique is the fact that he shoots tranquilizers at you, which you just sort of pull up, and so he kind of can't kill you, and once you know that, that's sort of lame. But I'll say, at the very least, when you're going through the first time, if I went through now, it probably wouldn't be as impactful, but my first time going through, God, that fight was so good. And it is the only time in this entire review, which means that I have to take this opportunity to do it, that I can say that this is so much better than Metal Gear Solid 5. Seriously, the fact that they went from the fight against the end to the fight against Quiet is like, what happened, guys? Don't get me wrong, the Quiet fight in MGS5 isn't horrible, but this is just so much better. Anyways, really, aside from the end, it felt like most of the bosses had maybe 1 or 2 mechanics, and once you figured that out, you just sort of blasted them, and they were kind of just bullet sponges you shot a few times. At the end of my gameplay, I think the only 2 that will stick with me are the fight against the boss and the fight against the end, but they were both really good fights, and I enjoyed them a lot. On an overall front for gameplay though, as I've already said, I just think that the game is so inferior from today's modern games, and that's the thing that I was sort of worried about going into the game to begin with. One of the reasons that I could enjoy MGS 1 and 2 is because their gameplay styles are so unique to today's games that it's hard to even compare them. But here, it's incredibly easy to compare this game to MGS5 because in gameplay they're so similar, but that game is just more refined. And I'm sure there are going to be people that are upset and say that it's an unfair comparison to compare a game this old to a game that's that new and has so many leaps and bounds in technology, but the reality of the day is that people say that this is the best game in the franchise. And a lot of people cite gameplay for that reason, and I just simply cannot agree. Of course, when we talk about story, there's going to be a lot of personal preferences involved. And because of that, all of the things that I'm about to say are pretty much entirely subjective. Overall, I really enjoyed MGS3's story, and playing through it, despite generally knowing the plot beats, was still engaging from start to finish. That being said, I don't think that the story was as engaging as Metal Gear Solid 2's. I don't know if that's a hot take or not, it probably is, but overall the revelations from MGS2 were a hell of a lot more heavy hitting than the ones in MGS3. As I said at the beginning of the video, there's a decent chance that this stems from the fact that I basically knew nothing about MGS2's story going in, whereas MGS3, I already had a general idea of the plot. Overall, the twists and turns that the game takes throughout just didn't quite feel as impactful as they did in the second entry. That being said, I do think that the story is enough of a draw to the game that I once again, just like with the second game, don't want to directly spoil the game for you. And I do feel that with games like this especially, where the emphasis is so heavily on story, that I can't in good faith spoil all of it here because it will thoroughly encourage you to simply never try out the game for yourself, and that would be a waste. The only real nitpick that I guess I'd have with the story is honestly a series general nitpick when it comes to Metal Gear as a whole, and that's that Kojima has a really bad habit of tell don't show all the time, and feels the need to explain every single tiny little detail, which especially in cutscenes gets real old, and watching stock footage of someone explaining something to me, I'll just come out and say it, sometimes it just isn't very interesting. Most of the time it is, but sometimes it just sort of makes my eyes glaze over. But again, this is not a critique of MGS3, this is sort of a critique of Hideo Kojima's directing style as a whole. Overall, on the topic of story though, it was good, and just like with MGS2, I think it's reason enough for playing through the game. So the final note that I want to talk about before we talk about the score is the music. And just like with MGS2, goddamn, it slaps. The final score of MGS3 is a difficult one, because I know at this point, with all of my criticisms, no matter what I say, I'm just gonna piss people off. I pissed people off from the very beginning, and if they somehow got to this point, they're still pissed off. That being said, I want those people to understand at the end of the day that I did thoroughly enjoy the game. It's not like I came out of the experience being like, wow, that sucked, or, oh, I should have just played Metal Gear Solid 5. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying that while I did enjoy the game, I think that there's a lot of problems with it, and a lot of the things that people touted as it being the best in the series, well, that I can't even come close to agree with. That being said, the final score for Metal Gear Solid 3 is, just like with MGS2, a 7 out of 10. it gets the exact same score. The fact of the matter is, the reason MGS3 gets the exact same score as MGS2 is that despite the fact that the game is a sequel and technically should have improved in most if not all of the factors, and technically did do those things, the fact that it's so similar to today's Metal Gear Solid holds it back a lot. It means that I can't in good faith take away any points, but I also can't give it any more points either. While it fixed several of the problems that I had with that game's systems, it also introduced its fair share of its own issues. And at the end of the day, things like the cure menu and the difficulty basically taking a nosedive take enough away from the experience that it ends up pretty much right back where we started. Now granted, right back where we started is far from bad. 7 out of 10 is an above average game, and something that I can absolutely recommend. As I said in my Metal Gear Solid 2 video, if you have the capabilities to get the Metal Gear Master Collection, I highly recommend you do so, as I think the price point is more than reasonable for all of these fantastic games. While I have no intentions of ever playing Metal Gear 1 or 2, I can say MGS1, MGS2, and MGS3 are all well worth the price of admission, and all have different reasons for booting them up. Either way, as much as I can try to justify my opinions to you guys, there's only so much I can do. So with that, we're wrapping up here. As always, if you enjoyed the video, you can leave a like and subscribe. If you didn't, don't. And with all that being said, have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you guys next time.